The first gunshot sounds wrong. Too calm. Too clean. Andy feels it before she hears it, a ripple in the air that tells her this mission has already gone sideways. The desert heat presses against her skin as she moves, boots crunching gravel, eyes locked on the target building ahead. She's done this for centuries. Wars blur together after a while. Different flags. Same blood. Same screams. And yet, something in her chest tightens like it always does before the violence begins. Instinct. Memory. Or maybe exhaustion pretending to be instinct. Inside, the firefight explodes. Bullets tear through walls, bodies drop, and Andy doesn't slow down. She never does. Blades flash. Gunfire roars. Pain lands and disappears just as fast. Her team moves like a single organism. Joe and Nikki watching each other's backs without thinking. Booker covering angles with the tired precision of a man who's seen too much. They win. They always win. And then they die. All of them. Over and over. Until silence swallows the room. Minutes later, Andy's eyes snap open. She drags in air like she's been underwater. The wounds are gone. The blood already drying on the floor. Around her, the others rise too, coughing, swearing, laughing softly like people who've shared the same nightmare for far too long. This is their secret. Immortality that doesn't sparkle or bless. It just continues. Andy watches the door, jaw tight. Someone new. Someone set them up. And that thought scares her more than death ever could. Far away, in a sterile military lab, a young Marine named Nile Freeman stares at the wound in her abdomen that should have killed her. She remembers the blade going in. The heat. The shock. The certainty of the end. But now there's only smooth skin and trembling hands. Her heart slams against her ribs as doctors whisper and step back. Nile feels exposed, like the world has suddenly peeled her open. She doesn't understand what she is anymore. She just knows something is very, very wrong. That night, Andy dreams. She hates the dreams. A woman screaming underwater. A coffin sinking into darkness. Hands pounding from the inside until they bleed. Andy wakes with a sharp inhale, fingers curled like claws. She knows that dream. It's not memory. It's a warning. Another immortal has appeared. And immortals don't stay hidden for long, not in this world, not anymore. Booker finds the proof first. Grainy footage. A soldier stabbed through the torso who stands back up like nothing happened. He doesn't say anything at first, just watches Andy's face as she sees it too. Her expression hardens, but there's fear underneath. Not for Nile. For what comes next. Because every new immortal brings attention. And attention brings hunters. They move fast. Planes. Safe houses. The kind of preparation you only make when you know exactly how ugly things can get. Joe jokes to break the tension. Nikki prays under his breath. Andy says nothing. She's thinking about how many times she's watched the world learn their secret. How many times it ended with chains, cells, scalpels. Humans don't fear monsters. They fear miracles they can't control. Nile feels them before she sees them. A presence. Heavy. Ancient. When Andy steps into the room, Nile's breath catches. There's something in Andy's eyes that doesn't belong to any living soldier. Not pity. Not anger. Recognition. Recognition. Andy tells her the truth slowly, carefully, like you'd speak to someone standing on the edge of a cliff. You can't die. You will heal. And one day, it might stop. Or it might not. No one knows. Outside, unseen, a man watches screens light up with their faces. He smiles, fingers steepled, pulse quickening at the thought of it. Immortality. Not as myth. As a resource. And for the first time in a long while, Andy feels the weight of time pressed down harder than ever, because this time, the enemy isn't a battlefield. It's the future. Nile doesn't sleep that night. Every time she closes her eyes, she feels the blade again, sliding in like it owns her body. She sits on the edge of the bed, fists clenched, staring at Andy across the dim safehouse room. Andy doesn't pace, doesn't fidget. She just waits, back against the wall, eyes alert like rest is a forgotten luxury. Nile finally breaks. So that's it? Her voice cracks. I just keep getting back up. Andy nods once. Not comforting, just honest. Until you don't. They move before dawn. No explanations to neighbors. No goodbyes to normal life. Nile feels herself being erased in real time. In the van, Joe tries to soften the edges with humor, tells her she's joined the worst club on earth. Nikki squeezes Joe's hand, silent but steady. Booker watches Nile in the mirror, eyes heavy with something like regret. Andy notices everything. She always does. And what she sees in Nile scares her. Not the fear, but the fire underneath it. Miles away, Merrick's team scrubs through footage frame by frame. Healing tissue. No scars. No degradation. The scientist whispers numbers like prayers. Merrick doesn't blink. He sees centuries of disease erased, death postponed indefinitely, and profit stacked higher than morality ever stood. Find them, he says, quietly. And when his assistant hesitates, he smiles. People give up secrets when they're in pain. The first attack comes fast. Too fast. A convoy ambush on a narrow road, bullets shredding metal, glass exploding inward. Nile screams as the van flips. The world spins. Bone snaps. And then, nothing. She wakes pinned under wreckage, lungs burning, body already knitting itself back together. Andy drags her free while rounds tear through the dust. Andy takes 3 to the chest and doesn't slow. Nile sees it clearly now. The horror, the beauty, the curse. This isn't survival. It's endurance. After, when the smoke clears, Nile throws up behind a rock. Her hands shake uncontrollably. Andy crouches beside her, voice low. You'll get used to the pain, she says. You won't get used to what it costs. Nile looks up. You sound like you hate this. Andy doesn't answer. Silence stretches. Finally, I hate what it does to people who come near us. That night, truths spill. Around a battered table, Andy explains the rules. Healing slows with age. Immortality isn't guaranteed. One day, without warning, it stops. Joe jokes again, but softer now. Booker drinks too much and talks too freely. He tells Nile about losing his family again and again, watching generations fade like smoke. Nile listens, chest aching with a future she didn't choose. Andy watches Booker closely. Something in his tone feels off. Desperate. Slippery. Nile dreams for the first time since turning. Not of death, but of drowning. Cold, endless, dark. A woman's face presses against glass, eyes wide with fury and betrayal. Nile wakes gasping, tears on her cheeks. Andy is already there. She knows that look. You saw her, Andy whispers. Nile nods. She's alive. Andy's face goes pale. Quinn. The name tastes like grief. Buried. Lost. Not dead. The past isn't finished with them yet. By morning, Merrick has their location. Booker steps outside to make a call, hands trembling. He tells himself it's temporary, that he's ending it, that centuries of running can finally stop. Inside, Andy sharpens her blade, unease crawling up her spine. She feels it, the shift, the wrongness in the air. And when the doors explode inward and gas floods the room, Andy realizes too late that this time, immortality won't save them. Because cages don't need to kill you. They just need to hold. The world comes back in pieces. Cold metal. Straps biting into skin. The sour sting of antiseptic. Andy opens her eyes and immediately understands the shape of the room without looking. No windows, reinforced walls, cameras humming softly like insects. A cage dressed up as a laboratory. She tests her arms. They don't move. Across from her, Joe is already awake, jaw clenched, eyes burning. Nikki hangs limp for a second longer before he inhales sharply, panic flashing before discipline slams it down. Booker is there too. Quiet. Too quiet. Merrick doesn't rush. He never does. He enters like a man stepping into a church, hands clean, suit perfect, eyes shining with reverence. He talks about miracles. About humanity's future. About how suffering now will save millions later. Andy spits blood at his shoes. He smiles like he expected that. When the knives come out, Nile screams. She throws herself against her restraints until her muscles tear, and then heal. Over and over. She learns quickly what Merrick means by testing. Pain becomes routine. Death becomes a button. Someone else presses. Drownings. Dissections. Suffocation that lasts just long enough to feel eternity. Andy endures it all in silence, counting heartbeats, clinging to rage because rage still feels like control. But something is wrong. She notices it during the third execution. The wound stays open a second too long. The blood doesn't pull itself back right away. Fear slides in, cold and sharp. She hides it. She always hides it. Between sessions, Merrick talks. He shows graphs, healing rates, cellular decay. Andy watches the numbers and realizes the truth before he says it out loud. She's losing it. Her immortality is slipping away. Centuries of survival, ending not in a battlefield but under fluorescent lights. Merrick sees the realization hit her and finally looks satisfied. "You're different," he says softly. "Finite." Andy laughs. It sounds broken. "So are you," she whispers. "You just don't know when." Nile is the only one Merrick can't fully control. She heals fast, too fast, and she watches. She memorizes guard patterns, key cards, the way Merrick's men underestimate her because she still cries. One night, when they leave her alone longer than usual, she reaches inward toward that strange pull she felt in her dreams. Toward the woman in the dark. Nile whispers without sound. And somewhere far away, something listens. Booker avoids Andy's eyes. Guilt clings to him heavier than the restraints ever could. He tells himself he did this for peace. For an end. But watching Joe die again and again breaks something inside him. Joe still finds the strength to smile at Nikki, even when his body is falling apart. Love like that doesn't make sense. It just survives. Booker finally understands what he sold out wasn't immortality. It was them. The escape is messy, violent, perfectly imperfect. Nile breaks free first, using a guard's shock when she doesn't stay dead. She moves through the corridors like instinct-made flesh, freeing Joe and Nikki, then Booker. Andy is last, weak, bleeding, still standing. Nile cuts her loose and feels the difference immediately. Andy sags, breath ragged. Mortal. The word lands like a curse, like freedom. Merrick tries to run. He doesn't get far. He doesn't get far. Andy faces him alone, sword heavy in her hand. For the first time in centuries, every strike matters. Every mistake could be final. She kills him anyway. Not clean, not quick. When it's over, she stands there shaking, alive in a way she hasn't felt since before history learned her name. They burn the lab. Evidence erased. Secrets swallowed by fire. Outside, dawn breaks pale and quiet. Booker confesses without excuses. Andy listens. Then she sentences him to exile, 100 years alone. Worse than death. He accepts it. He deserves it. As they leave, Nile looks back once. She feels the pull again. Stronger now. Somewhere, in cold black water, a woman still screams. And Andy, mortal at last, realizes some debts don't expire with time. They only wait. Time moves differently after survival. Slower, heavier. The team scatters for weeks, healing in places that don't ask questions. Andy feels every mile now. Every bruise lingers. Every cut stings like a reminder she can't ignore. Mortality isn't loud, it's subtle. A stiffness in the joints. Fatigue that sleep doesn't erase. And beneath it all, something unfamiliar. Relief tangled with terror. For the first time since the Stone Age, her life has edges. Nile watches Andy carefully. She sees the way Andy sits down before she needs to now. The way she breathes through pain instead of letting it wash away. Nile doesn't say anything. Respect feels like silence. Instead, she trains harder. Pushes longer. Because if Andy can die, someone has to be ready to stand when she can't. Joe notices too. Nikki does. They close ranks without speaking. Love doesn't need instructions. The dreams get worse. Not just flashes now, but whole scenes. Water pressing in. Wood splintering from the inside. Fingernails torn bloody against a coffin lid that never opens. Nile wakes choking, lungs screaming for air that isn't missing. Andy sits with her through it, face tight with guilt that's centuries old. Her name was Quinn, Andy finally says, and I left her. The words crack something open. Nile doesn't judge. She just listens. Some sins don't want forgiveness. They want witnesses. They track the source of the dreams to the coast. Rusted docks, salt in the air, an abandoned shipyard where secrets rot quietly. Nile feels it the moment they arrive. A pressure in her skull, a pull toward the black water beyond the pier. Andy follows, heart pounding, knowing before she sees it. The ocean holds memories better than land ever could, and it doesn't give them back easily. They find the coffin buried deep, chained like someone was afraid it might claw its way out. Andy's hands shake as they haul it up. Centuries of silence locked inside weathered iron. When they break it open, water spills out like a scream finally released. Quinn gasps, screams, fights. Her eyes find Andy and fill with a fury so pure it burns. Immortality kept her alive. It didn't keep her sane. Quinn's rage is biblical. She attacks without hesitation, hands shaking with the need to hurt the face she memorized in darkness. Andy doesn't fight back at first. She lets the blows land, lets bones crack, blood spill. Because this pain, she earned it. Nile steps in only when it turns lethal. Quinn collapses, sobbing, torn between relief and hatred. Joe and Nikki keep watch, weapons lowered, reverent. Some reunions aren't beautiful. They're necessary. Later, wrapped in blankets, Quinn speaks in fragments. Of drowning, of counting heartbeats, of praying for madness to come faster. Andy listens until her chest aches. I thought you chose them, Quinn whispers. Andy shakes her head. I chose fear. The admission lands heavier than any apology. Quinn doesn't forgive her. Not yet, maybe not ever. But she stays. That night, around a small fire, the team sits together. Broken, bonded, unfinished. Nile realizes something then. This isn't about immortality. It never was. It's about what time does to love when it stretches too long. What happens when survival costs more than death? Andy stares into the flames, feeling warmth soak into mortal skin, and understands the final truth she's been avoiding. Living forever wasn't the curse. Living without endings was. Somewhere far away, a screen flickers on. A new player watches old footage, eyes narrowing with interest. The hunt didn't die with Merrick, it evolved. And as the fire crackles low, Nile feels the pull again, stronger than ever. This story isn't over. It's just learned how to bleed. They don't stay in one place long after that. Old habits die hard, even when death finally feels real. Andy leads them through safe routes etched into her memory over centuries. Monasteries that owe her favors, deserts where satellites don't linger, cities that swallow faces without asking names. But the pace is different now. Urgent. Compressed. Like the world has started closing in faster than before. Andy feels it most when she trains. Blades still answer her hands, but slower. Breath burns sooner. Sweat chills her skin. Mortality whispers in every ache. Nile notices how Andy watches her now, not as a recruit, but as a successor. The unspoken weight of that presses into Nile's spine. She didn't ask to inherit this war, but here it is, breathing down her neck. Quinn stays distant. She speaks little, sleeps less. The sea hasn't let go of her yet. Some nights, Nile hears her screaming in languages no one remembers. Joe sits with her when it happens, calm and patient, explaining the world she woke into. Centuries lost. Empire's dust. Nikki brings food she barely touches. Healing a mind takes longer than healing flesh. Sometimes, it never finishes. The next threat announces itself without subtlety. An attack in Jakarta. Immortals caught on camera again. This time, the footage is sharper, faster, weaponized. Someone learned from Merrick's mistakes. Andy watches the clip on a cracked tablet, jaw tightening. They're baiting us, she says. And she hates that she's right. Nile sees the decision form before Andy speaks it. They're going in. The fight is brutal. Controlled chaos spilling through tight corridors. Joe and Nikki move like dancers, deadly and devoted. Quinn fights like a storm, finally allowed to break rage focused into purpose. Nile keeps up, heart pounding, instincts screaming, healing almost before the pain registers. Andy pushes herself past limits she can't afford anymore. A bullet grazes her side and doesn't seal. Blood keeps flowing. Nile sees it. Fear sharpens into steel. They win, but barely. As sirens wail in the distance, Andy leans against a wall, pale, shaking. Nile presses a hand to the wound, trying to slow what her body can't reverse. Andy meets her eyes and smiles faintly. "Not today," she murmurs. Hope against odds. Small, stubborn, alive. That night, Andy makes a choice. She gives Nile the full truth. The history. The mistakes. The name she buried. "I don't know how long I have," Andy says quietly, "but I know you're ready." Nile wants to argue, wants to say she's still afraid. Instead, she nods. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing anyway. They split paths briefly. Joe and Nikki vanish into the noise of the world, guardians in the shadows. Quinn chooses the sea. Not as a prison this time, but as a reminder she survived it. She tells Andy she doesn't forgive her. Then she thanks her for coming back. Sometimes that's enough. At dawn, Andy and Nile sit together, watching light spill over a quiet city. Andy's breathing is slow, fragile, human. "Whatever happens," Andy says, "don't let them turn us into things." Nile swallows. "We won't." Far away, unseen, new eyes study fresh footage. Patterns forming. Plans evolving. The world doesn't stop wanting what it can't have. The final confrontation doesn't announce itself with explosions. It arrives quietly. A pattern Nile recognizes too late. Accounts freezing, contacts disappearing, safe routes collapsing one by one. Someone isn't hunting them with guns anymore. They're hunting them with patience. Andy feels it in her bones. This enemy isn't reckless. This one learned. They track the signal to a fortified research complex tucked beneath a city that never sleeps. Concrete layered over secrets. Power humming like a living thing. Andy studies the blueprints, fingers lingering on exits, on places where a mortal mistake would be final. She hands leadership over without ceremony. Nile takes it without hesitation. Their eyes meet. No words. Everything said. They breach at night. Silent. Precise. Inside, alarms bloom anyway. Red lights flood the corridors. The new antagonist steps onto a balcony above them, clapping slowly. Not Merrick. Smarter. Colder. A believer, not in profit, but in control. "You're obsolete," he calls down. "But your replacements." His gaze lands on Nile. Fascinating. The trap closes fast. Gas. Drones. Automated fire. Joe and Nikki split off, drawing heat with practiced ease. Quinn holds a choke point alone, fury sharpened into focus. Andy pushes forward with Nile, lungs burning, vision tunneling. Every step hurts. Every step matters. A drone clips Andy's shoulder. She stumbles. Doesn't heal. Nile catches her. Keeps moving. They reach the core lab. Servers stacked like altars. Data humming with stolen lives. Nile understands the choice instantly. Destroy the data and vanish forever, or keep running and let the world keep building cages. Andy collapses to one knee, blood dark on her sleeve. She looks up at Nile, eyes clear. Peaceful. "Do it," she says. "End it." The enemy rushes in, weapon raised. Andy stands anyway. Mortal legs. Immortal resolve. Immortal resolve. She steps between Nile and the gun. The shot hits her center mass. The sound is small. Final. Andy falls. Time fractures. Nile screams, raw and wordless, something ancient tearing free inside her. She doesn't think. She moves. She dismantles the lab with brutal efficiency, blades and bullets and fire. Joe and Nikki reappear, wounded but unstoppable. Quinn joins them, silent and lethal. The enemy tries to flee. Nile stops him. No speech, no mercy. Some lessons don't need explaining. As flames eat through the servers, Nile kneels beside Andy, blood everywhere. Too much. Andy's breath rattles. She smiles faintly. "Worth it," she whispers. Nile grips her hand, tears blinding. You don't get to decide that. Andy squeezes back, weak but sure. You do. The building collapses inward, swallowing secrets, erasing blueprints, burning a future that shouldn't exist. They escape into the night with seconds to spare. Sirens fade. Ash drifts like snow. Dawn finds them on a rooftop, quiet. Wind moving gently through the wreckage of a city that will never know what almost happened. Andy lies still, eyes closed. Nile listens for breath. Counts. Once. Twice. A third time. Nothing. Then air. A shallow inhale. Nile freezes. Andy coughs. Blood bubbles. And then, impossibly, the wound pulls together. Slow. Painful. Real. But healing. Andy gasps, shock written across her face. I felt it stop, she says hoarsely. Nile laughs through sobs, pressing her forehead to Andy's. Guess you're not done yet. They sit there as the sun rises, warmth spilling over them both. Andy doesn't feel immortal. She feels earned. Chosen. Alive in a way she never let herself be before. Whatever changed inside her isn't a reset. It's a reminder. This isn't about living forever. It's about choosing what you're willing to die for. The world doesn't end with a bang. It exhales. Weeks pass. No headlines. No miracles exposed. Just the quiet after something enormous chooses to disappear. Andy heals slowly this time, scars lingering like signatures she doesn't bother hiding. Each one reminds her she's still here because she chose to be, not because time trapped her into it. Nile stays close, not as a shadow, but as an equal. They train. They argue. They argue. They laugh softly at first, like the sound might break something fragile. Joe and Nikki send postcards from places that don't exist on maps, short notes, terrible jokes, proof that love can survive centuries without turning bitter. Quinn drifts between coasts and cities, learning how to live above water again. She doesn't forgive Andy, not fully. But sometimes she calls. Sometimes she stays on the line. That's progress. That's mercy. One night, Andy wakes without pain. No dreams of drowning. No screams echoing through centuries. Just silence. She steps outside and feels the air on her skin. Cool, real, fleeting. Mortality hums under everything now, not as a threat, but as texture. Time has flavor again. Every moment sharp. Precious. Finite. Nile finds her watching the horizon. You okay? Andy nods. Better than okay, she says. I'm afraid. Nile smiles. Good. Fear means something matters. They move on. Not running anymore. Choosing. Conflicts that don't need armies. People who need help but don't want gods. They intervene quietly, leave no monuments, no legends, just absence where violence would have been. Andy lets Nile take point more often now. Leadership suits her. Andy doesn't feel diminished by it. She feels free. One evening, after a job goes clean, they sit on a rooftop with takeout cartons and cheap beer. The city below buzzes, unaware. Nile asks the question she's been holding back. When it ends, she says carefully, Are you scared? Andy thinks for a long time. Then she shakes her head. I was scared when it didn't, she answers. This? She looks at her hands. This feels fair. The sun rises slow and gold. Andy closes her eyes and lets it warm her face. She thinks about every life she's lived, every war survived, every mistake that still aches. And for the first time, the weight of it all doesn't crush her. It settles, becomes part of the ground she stands on. Nile watches her mentor, her friend, this woman carved out of centuries, and understands the truth at last. Immortality was never the gift. Choice was. And choice is something you earn every single day. They stand together as the light spreads, two figures against an endless sky. One who's lived too long, one who will live long enough, and neither of them alone anymore. Somewhere, far beneath oceans and ruins and time, the world keeps its secrets. But these ones? They're done hiding. Andy turns to Nile with a small, genuine smile. Come on, she says. We've still got work to do. The old guard arrives with a quiet kind of confidence, the sort that doesn't shout its ambitions, but lets them surface through craft. This is Gina Prince-Bythewood's film, through and through. A director known for intimate, character-driven dramas like Love and Basketball and Beyond the Lights, stepping into the Immortal Warriors action genre sounds, on paper, like a left turn. It isn't. It's an expansion. Prince-Bythewood doesn't abandon her sensibilities here. She weaponizes them. Instead of treating immortality as spectacle, she treats it as a burden, and that single choice defines everything that follows. Prince-Bythewood came into this project without the usual blockbuster resume, and that matters. Netflix wasn't hiring a filmmaker shaped by franchise logic. They were betting on someone who understands interior lives. Her background is rooted in emotional realism, in stories where characters are defined by longing, regret, and the slow erosion of hope. So when she approaches a graphic novel adaptation about soldiers who cannot die, her instinct isn't to ask how cool the fights can look. It's to ask what centuries of violence would do to a person's soul. That question becomes the film's spine. The source material, Greg Rucka and Leandro Fernandez's The Old Guard comics, already leans philosophical, but Prince-Bythewood sharpens that edge. She gravitates toward the melancholy embedded in the premise. Living forever sounds like a gift, until you're the only one left standing at every grave. Her direction frames immortality, not as power fantasy, but as emotional isolation stretched across centuries. You feel that choice immediately in the pacing. Scenes breathe. Silence lingers. The film isn't in a hurry to impress you, because it's more interested in making you sit with the cost of survival. What's striking about her vision is how deliberately grounded it is. Even when the story spans centuries, Prince-Bythewood keeps pulling the camera back to the human scale. Faces, hands, small gestures. She directs action the same way she directs dialogue, with clarity and intention. Fights are brutal, but not fetishized. Violence lands hard, then moves on. No slow-motion glory shots begging for applause. Just consequence. That restraint feels like a conscious rejection of how immortality stories are usually framed in cinema, where endless life is either romanticized or turned into a gimmick. Her collaboration style also shapes the film's identity. Prince-Bythewood is known for creating spaces where actors contribute to character construction, and that collaborative energy shows. The Old Guard doesn't feel imposed from above, it feels inhabited. Characters carry history in their posture, not just in exposition. That's a director trusting performance over spectacle. Trusting viewers to read subtext. Trusting stillness. In a genre that often confuses noise for depth, that's a bold move. Netflix's role here is crucial. As a platform, Netflix has been more willing than traditional studios to let filmmakers bend genre expectations, and Prince-Bythewood takes full advantage. The film doesn't chase a theatrical blockbuster rhythm. It settles into something closer to a long-form character study with action punctuations. That's not accidental. It reflects a streaming-era understanding of audience engagement, people willing to spend time with characters rather than just consume set pieces. Prince-Bythewood's vision aligns perfectly with that shift. There's also a quiet political dimension to her approach. Without turning the film into a manifesto, she frames immortality through lenses of gender, race, and queerness that mainstream action cinema rarely centers. This isn't just representation as casting. It's representation as perspective. Who gets to live forever? Who bears the cost of protecting a world that never thanks them? Prince-Bythewood doesn't underline these questions. She lets them sit there, uncomfortable, unresolved. That restraint gives them power. Perhaps the most telling aspect of her vision is how she treats leadership. Charlize Theron's Andy isn't directed as an invincible icon. She's filmed as someone exhausted by command. Prince-Bythewood consistently places her slightly apart from the group, visually and emotionally. Leadership here is lonely. Immortality makes it lonelier. That framing choice turns what could have been a standard action protagonist into something far more fragile and far more interesting. By the time the film settles into its rhythm, it's clear that, The old guard isn't trying to reinvent action cinema through scale or novelty. Its ambition is quieter and arguably riskier. Prince-Bythewood sets out to prove that an action film can be thoughtful without being slow, emotional without being sentimental, inclusive without being performative. Whether it fully succeeds is a debate worth having. But the intent is unmistakable. This is a filmmaker using genre as a vessel, not a cage. The strength of The Old Guard's screenplay lies in its refusal to over-explain a concept that could easily drown in mythology. The story comes from Greg Rucka himself, adapting his own comic series for the screen, and that continuity matters. This isn't an outsider translating a property they admire. It's the original architect reshaping his idea for a different medium. Rucka understands exactly what needs to change, and, more importantly, what must stay untouched. The result is a script that feels confident in its rules and uninterested in hand-holding. At its core, the narrative is deceptively simple. A group of immortal mercenaries, led by Andromache of Scythia, operate in secrecy until modern surveillance exposes them. But the screenplay treats that simplicity as a feature, not a flaw. Rucka structures the film around revelation rather than escalation. Instead of piling on twists, he slowly widens the lens, letting the audience discover the implications of immortality piece by piece. Each new story beat isn't about what happens next. It's about what this existence costs. The screenplay's most important decision is where it begins. We don't open on ancient battlefields or mythic origins. We open on a job. Guns, tactics, professionalism. These people are already a unit. That choice immediately grounds the story in the present tense. Immortality becomes something we infer, not something we're lectured about. When the first resurrection happens, the shock isn't just visual, it's narrative. The script lets disbelief bloom naturally, mirroring the audience's reaction instead of preempting it with exposition. Rucka also avoids the typical three-act superhero spine. This isn't an origin story in disguise. Andy doesn't learn who she is. She's already painfully aware. The emotional arc belongs elsewhere, to Nile, the newly immortal soldier whose confusion and anger give the audience a point of entry. Structurally, that's a smart pivot. By anchoring the narrative to Nile's awakening, the script externalizes questions the older characters stopped asking centuries ago. Why keep fighting? Why protect a world that keeps breaking itself? Nile asks what they no longer can. Dialogue does heavy lifting here, but it's restrained. Characters don't speak in speeches, they speak in fatigue. Rucka writes conversations that feel worn down by repetition, as if these arguments have happened before, because they have. When Andy explains immortality, it isn't poetic, it's blunt, almost annoyed. The lack of romantic language is the point. Living forever isn't lyrical, it's administrative. You heal, you move on, you bury another friend. One of the script's quiet achievements is how it handles time. Flashbacks are sparse, carefully placed, and emotionally strategic. We see just enough of the past to understand its weight without letting it hijack the present story. Each historical glimpse is tied to loss, not triumph. Lovers aging, friends dying, civilizations passing. These moments aren't world-building flourishes. They're emotional punctuation marks. The screenplay uses history not to impress, but to bruise. The antagonist structure reflects the film's thematic interests. The true conflict isn't just with a pharmaceutical executive who wants to monetize immortality. It's with modern systems of exploitation. Rucka frames the villain less as a mastermind and more as an inevitability. Of course, someone would try to own this. Of course, capitalism would come knocking. That banality makes the threat unsettling. The script understands that the scariest villains aren't mustache-twirling tyrants. They're men in boardrooms with PowerPoint decks. Importantly, the screenplay resists easy moral binaries. The old guard aren't saints. They kill for hire. They choose which causes deserve protection. Rucka doesn't absolve them, but he doesn't condemn them either. He presents their choices as compromises made under the weight of endless time. That moral grayness is baked into the dialogue and structure. There's no speech about saving the world. There's just the decision to keep going. Again. The final act doesn't aim for narrative closure so much as thematic continuation. The script leaves threads deliberately loose, not just to set up a sequel, but to reinforce the idea that immortality doesn't come with neat endings. Stories don't resolve. They accumulate. That choice may frustrate viewers expecting a conventional payoff, but it aligns perfectly with the film's philosophical core. This isn't a tale about victory. It's about endurance. What makes the screenplay work, ultimately, is its restraint. Rucka trusts silence. He trusts implication. He trusts the audience to connect emotional dots without spelling them out. In a genre addicted to overstatement, that confidence feels refreshing. The writing doesn't chase grandeur, it chases truth inside an impossible premise. And that truth, about exhaustion, purpose, and the quiet terror of living too long, lands because the script never flinches from it. Casting. The Old Guard wasn't about star power alone. It was about credibility. Physical, emotional, and thematic. These characters have lived for centuries. They've loved, killed, lost, adapted. You can't fake that weight. And the film's casting succeeds because it prioritizes presence over polish, texture over familiarity. Every major choice feels deliberate, even when it looks obvious in hindsight. Charlize Theron as Andy is the anchor, and not just because she's the biggest name. Theron brings a specific kind of authority that can't be taught. Her career has oscillated between raw vulnerability, Monster, North Country, and steel-plated physicality, Mad Max, Fury Road, Atomic Blonde. That combination makes her uniquely suited to play someone who is both exhausted and lethal. The casting works because she doesn't need to announce leadership. It sits in her posture, in the way she enters a room already aware of every exit. You believe people would follow her. You also believe she's tired of being followed. But here's the crucial part. Theron isn't cast to glamorize immortality. She's cast to undercut it. Prince-Bythewood leans into Theron's ability to project weariness without weakness. Andy isn't brittle, but she's worn thin. That texture matters. A younger or more traditionally invincible action star would have shifted the entire film's tone toward fantasy. Theron keeps it grounded in consequence. Kiki Layne's casting as Nile is equally strategic, though in a different way. Layne was relatively unknown to mainstream audiences at the time, and that unfamiliarity becomes an asset. Nile needs to feel like an interruption, someone not yet shaped by the group's emotional armor. Layne brings openness, curiosity, and barely contained fear. She looks like someone still processing the idea of who she is, which contrasts sharply with the other's settled resignation. Casting a major star here would have distorted that dynamic. Nile isn't supposed to arrive fully formed. She's becoming. The ensemble around them is where casting turns quietly brilliant. Matthias Schoenaerts as Booker carries melancholy like second skin. Schoenaerts has a face that suggests regret even in stillness, and the film uses that. His physicality, broad, solid, heavy, contrasts with his emotional fragility. You feel that Booker isn't just haunted by the past, he's suffocating under it. That emotional density gives the character credibility long before the script asks us to reckon with his choices. Marwan Kenzari and Luca Marinelli as Joe and Nikki represent perhaps the film's most emotionally resonant casting decision. Their chemistry isn't performative. It feels lived in. Prince-Bythewood didn't cast them to make a point. She cast them because they feel like people who have survived centuries together. Kenzari brings intensity and sharp intelligence, while Marinelli radiates warmth and moral steadiness. Together, they balance fire and calm. Their relationship never pauses the film to explain itself. It simply exists. That normalcy is radical in its own quiet way. Chiwetel Ejiofor's casting as Copley is another smart pivot. Ejiofor carries intellectual authority without villainy. He feels like someone driven by belief rather than malice. That matters, because Copley isn't meant to be a mustache-twirling antagonist. He's a man who thinks he's doing the right thing, Ejiofor plays him with restraint, letting conviction simmer rather than explode. You understand him even when you oppose him. That empathy complicates the moral landscape in ways a more overtly sinister performance wouldn't. What's striking across the ensemble is the absence of vanity casting. No one feels dropped in to boost marketing metrics. Even the physical diversity of the cast feels organic rather than curated. These characters come from different centuries, different continents, different wars. The casting reflects that historical sprawl without turning it into spectacle. Representation here isn't an announcement. It's a byproduct of the story's logic. The chemistry between actors suggests careful testing and rehearsal. The group dynamics feel established from the first frame, which doesn't happen by accident. Prince-Bythewood's collaborative reputation likely played a role here. She's known for fostering trust, and that trust translates on screen. These actors don't perform at each other, they listen. That listening sells the idea that this group has fought side by side long enough to read silences as clearly as commands. Another key casting choice lies in physical authenticity. These actors look capable, not superhuman capable. Their movements feel practiced rather than choreographed. That's essential for a film where immortality doesn't negate pain. You need performers who can sell injury, fatigue, recovery. The casting leans toward actors with grounded physical presence rather than glossy perfection. Sweat matters in this film. So does breath. In aggregate, the casting of the old guard creates an unusual effect. You don't watch these characters and think about how well they were cast. You accept them immediately. That invisibility is the highest compliment casting can receive. It allows the film's deeper concerns, purpose, loyalty, exhaustion, to take center stage without distraction. Charlize Theron's performance in The Old Guard doesn't announce itself. It settles in. Slowly. Heavily. This isn't the kind of action lead built around bravado or spectacle. Andy is defined by what Theron withholds: emotion, explanation, optimism. Watch her closely and you'll notice how rarely she wastes energy. Every movement feels economical, as if centuries of repetition have sanded away anything unnecessary. That restraint is the performance. Andy's emotional arc is paradoxical. She doesn't change in the way traditional protagonists do. She deteriorates. Theron plays her as someone losing faith, not in humanity, but in purpose. There's a difference. Her eyes carry the exhaustion of having seen every version of the same mistake repeated across centuries. When she speaks about the world improving, there's no conviction behind it, just memory. Theron's voice flattens those lines deliberately, draining them of hope. That choice turns exposition into character revelation. Physically, Theron grounds Andy's immortality in pain rather than invincibility. She fights like someone who knows she'll heal, but also knows she'll feel every second before she does. There's no theatrical relish in the action. She absorbs blows. She grimaces. She endures. The choreography allows her to get hurt, and Theron leans into that vulnerability. The way she gets back up isn't triumphant. It's resigned. Again. That word keeps echoing through her performance. Again. Her most powerful moments aren't the fights, though. They're the silences. Watch her during Nile's early scenes. How she studies her. How she hesitates before answering questions she's answered 1,000 times before. Theron lets those pauses stretch just long enough to feel the weight behind them. She understands that Andy's leadership comes from experience, not certainty. And that uncertainty about whether any of this still matters is what makes her compelling. Kiki Layne's performance operates in direct contrast. Nile is all raw edges, and Layne embraces that. Her emotional arc is the most traditional in the film, but that doesn't make it simple. Layne plays Nile as someone whose identity fractures and reforms in real time. Confusion slides into anger. Anger hardens into defiance. Defiance softens into reluctant acceptance. You can track that progression physically. How she stands, how she breathes, how her gaze shifts from defensive to searching. Layne's greatest strength is emotional transparency. She doesn't armor Nile too early. Fear is allowed to linger. Grief is messy. When Nile realizes she can't die, Layne doesn't sell it as awe or excitement. It's terror. The kind that sits in your chest and refuses to move. Her breakdowns feel uncontained, almost inconvenient to the scene's rhythm. That's intentional. Nile doesn't yet know how to compartmentalize pain. The others do. That contrast defines the ensemble dynamic. The chemistry between Theron and Layne carries the film's emotional center. Their relationship isn't maternal, despite the age gap. It's transactional at first, mentor and liability. Over time, it shifts into something more complex, recognition. Layne plays Nile as a mirror Andy doesn't want to look into. Watching Nile struggle forces Andy to confront what she's lost. Theron lets that realization flicker across her face in moments of unguarded stillness. No dialogue needed. Matthias Schoenaerts delivers the film's most quietly devastating performance as Booker. He plays grief like gravity, always present, even when unseen. Booker's sorrow isn't explosive, it's compressive. Schoenaerts carries himself as if his body is folding inward, shoulders slightly rounded, gaze often lowered. His voice rarely rises. When it does, it cracks, not with anger, but with desperation. He sounds like someone pleading with time itself. The brilliance of Schoenaerts' work lies in how early he seeds Booker's fragility. Long before the script reveals the full extent of his conflict, the performance tells you something is off. He lingers on memories too long. He drinks not for pleasure, but for quiet. When betrayal finally surfaces, it feels tragic rather than shocking. Schoenaerts never plays Booker as a villain. He plays him as a man who finally broke. That distinction matters. Joe and Nikki, portrayed by Marwan Kenzari and Luca Marinelli, function as emotional stabilizers within the ensemble. But their performances are anything but background texture. Kenzari brings sharpness, intellect, wit, barely restrained ferocity. Marinelli counters with gentleness and moral clarity. Their performances are calibrated to complement rather than compete. They move like people who anticipate each other's rhythms. No wasted dialogue. No unnecessary explanations. Their love story works because neither actor performs it as a statement. There's no self-consciousness in their affection. It's practical, protective, deeply worn in. When Joe delivers his now iconic monologue about love, Kenzari doesn't elevate his voice or widen his gestures. He grounds the speech in certainty. This isn't poetry. It's fact. Marinelli's reaction sells it even more. He doesn't look surprised. He looks seen. That's the difference between performance and truth. Chiwetel Ejiofor's Copley adds another texture entirely. His performance is cerebral, controlled, and rooted in conviction. Ejiofor plays belief as both strength and blind spot. Copley isn't cruel, he's focused. That focus narrows his moral vision until consequences disappear. Ejiofor communicates that internal logic through precision-measured speech, deliberate movement, eyes always calculating. When doubt finally creeps in, it registers as destabilization. A man built on certainty suddenly off balance. What unites all these performances is restraint. No one overplays immortality. No one reaches for mythic grandeur. These actors ground an extraordinary premise in human behavior: fatigue, fear, loyalty, longing. The film trusts them to do that work without underline or embellishment. That trust pays off. What makes the Old Guard's ensemble work isn't just chemistry, it's balance. Each supporting performance fills an emotional and functional role that keeps the group from collapsing into sameness. Immortality, if portrayed without variation, becomes monotonous. This cast prevents that by embodying different survival strategies, different ways of carrying time. Together, they form something closer to a found family than a strike team. Joe and Nikki operate as the group's emotional anchor. While Andy leads and Booker doubts, they stabilize. Marwan Kenzari plays Joe with sharpened intensity, quick thinking, quick-tempered, fiercely loyal. There's a constant sense that he's scanning for threats, even in moments of calm. Luca Marinelli's Nicky, by contrast, is grounded and reflective. His stillness isn't passivity, it's conviction. He doesn't need to assert himself because he knows who he is. Their dynamic creates a rhythm. The film leans on repeatedly, fire tempered by faith. What's remarkable is how little screen time their relationship actually requires to feel complete. Prince-Bythewood and the actors understand that love this old doesn't need constant affirmation. Small gestures do the work. A hand on a shoulder, a glance held a second longer than necessary. These moments communicate history more effectively than any flashback could. Their bond isn't a subplot, it's a structural support beam. It reminds the audience that immortality doesn't erase intimacy, it intensifies it. Booker, on the other hand, exists in deliberate contrast to that stability. Matthias Schoenaerts plays him as someone who never quite reintegrates after each loss. While Joe and Nicky anchor themselves in each other, Booker drifts. His interactions with the group always feel half a step out of sync. He's present, but not aligned. That dissonance is subtle, but it's consistent. You sense it in how he hesitates before speaking, how he lags behind physically, how his gaze lingers on reminders of past lives. The ensemble benefits from the fact that no one tries to dominate scenes unnecessarily. Even when multiple strong personalities share the frame, the performances remain calibrated. Actors yield space to one another. That generosity allows quieter emotional beats to land without competition. It also reinforces the idea that this group has learned, over centuries, when to lead and when to step back. That instinctual hierarchy feels earned, not scripted. Chiwetel Ejiofor's Copley sits just outside the ensemble, and that placement is intentional. His performance is defined by separation, intellectually and morally. He isn't part of the group's emotional ecosystem, and the film never pretends otherwise. Ejiofor plays him as a man observing from a distance, studying patterns, measuring outcomes. His interactions with the group are transactional at first. Even when his perspective shifts, that analytical distance never fully disappears. It makes his eventual alignment feel like a choice, not an absorption. Nile's integration into the ensemble provides the film's most dynamic internal shift. Kiki Layne's performance allows the group's rhythms to be disrupted, and that disruption is necessary. Nile asks questions the others avoid. She challenges assumptions that calcified long ago. The ensemble reacts to her differently, Andy with guarded responsibility, Joe with impatience, Nicky with compassion, Booker with recognition. Those varied responses deepen our understanding of each character. Nile doesn't just join the group, she refracts it. One of the ensemble's strengths lies in how conflict is handled. Disagreements aren't explosive, they're weary. Arguments feel like echoes of past debates rather than fresh confrontations. That tonal choice reinforces the sense of long history. These people have fought before. About the same things. The restraint in those moments makes later emotional ruptures far more impactful. When trust breaks, it doesn't feel sudden, it feels inevitable. There's also a notable absence of humor for humor's sake. Lighter moments exist, but they emerge organically from relationships rather than punchlines. A shared look. Dry sarcasm. Gallows wit earned through repetition. This approach keeps the ensemble grounded and prevents tonal whiplash. Immortality isn't played for laughs. Survival humor is allowed, but it's sharp-edged and lived in. The ensemble dynamic ultimately reinforces the film's central argument. Immortality is only bearable when shared. Alone, it corrodes. Together, it becomes survivable, even meaningful. The performances make that thesis feel experiential rather than theoretical. You don't just hear it articulated, you feel it in the way characters occupy space together, in the way they move as a unit without needing to speak, in the way silence becomes a shared language. The physical world of the old guard feels lived in, not designed, and that's precisely the achievement. The film's production design doesn't announce itself with spectacle or excess. It embeds itself quietly into the frame, building a sense of authenticity that supports the characters rather than competing with them. This is a world shaped by consequence. Places feel used. Objects feel touched. Nothing looks new unless it has to. Production designer Andrew Menzies approaches the film with a philosophy of restraint. Instead of constructing elaborate, stylized environments, he favors grounded locations that suggest continuity between past and present. Warehouses look functional, not cinematic. Safe houses feel temporary, not personalized. These aren't spaces meant to impress, they're spaces meant to disappear into. That choice reinforces the idea that the characters don't linger anywhere long enough to invest emotionally. Every location is provisional. Everything is replaceable. The film's modern settings lean deliberately anonymous. Urban exteriors could be almost anywhere. Morocco, London, Paris, because for immortals, geography loses specificity over time. The production design reflects that flattening of the world. Distinctive landmarks rarely dominate the frame. Instead, we get transitional spaces, alleys, corridors, interiors stripped of identity. It's a subtle but effective way of visually expressing how centuries blur together. Costume design plays a crucial role in articulating character psychology. These aren't superhero outfits. They're functional, adaptable, and intentionally unremarkable. Andy's wardrobe, in particular, avoids visual flair. Leather jackets, muted tones, sturdy boots, clothes that signal readiness rather than identity. She dresses like someone who doesn't want to be remembered. That choice aligns perfectly with her emotional state. Immortality has taught her that attention invites danger. Joe and Nikki's costuming quietly mirrors their internal balance. Joe's clothing carries sharper lines and darker contrasts, reflecting his intensity and vigilance. Nikki's wardrobe leans softer in texture and tone, reinforcing his grounding presence. These distinctions aren't emphasized, but they're consistent. Over time, they register subconsciously, adding depth without distraction. Booker's costumes subtly reinforce his displacement. His clothes feel slightly out of step with the others, heavier, less streamlined. There's a sense that he's stuck in an earlier era, not stylistically but emotionally. His wardrobe carries weight, mirroring how he carries grief. These are choices that don't demand attention but reward it. The film's approach to historical flashbacks is equally restrained. When the story moves into the past, production design avoids pageantry. Battlefields are muddy, cramped, and chaotic. Period details are accurate but never indulgent. The past isn't romanticized. It's brutal, fleeting, and indifferent. These scenes exist to remind us of loss, not glory. The design keeps them grounded so they feel connected to the present rather than mythologized. Props are used sparingly, but meaningfully. Weapons aren't fetishized, they're tools. Guns are interchangeable. Blades are functional. There's no signature weapon that defines a character because identity here isn't tied to equipment. That choice undercuts the usual action movie logic, where gear becomes an extension of personality. In the old guard, survival skills matter more than objects. Tools are replaceable. People aren't. Color palette is another quiet storyteller. The film favors desaturated tones, grays, blues, earth colors, that drain the frame of excess warmth. When color does emerge, it's often tied to memory or intimacy. Warmth belongs to the past or to rare moments of connection. The present is colder, flatter, more clinical. That visual language reinforces the emotional divide between what these characters have lost and what they endure now. Even high-tech spaces, like corporate offices and labs, are designed without futuristic flourish. Glass, steel, clean lines, sterile environments that contrast sharply with the worn humanity of the immortals. These spaces feel predatory not because they're dark or ominous, but because they're efficient, designed for extraction. That design philosophy strengthens the film's critique of exploitation without spelling it out. What makes the production design especially effective is how invisible it feels. Nothing pulls focus. Nothing begs for admiration. Instead, it creates a container for performance. The environments give actors room to exist without distraction, allowing emotional beats to land cleanly. That invisibility is intentional. The design serves the story rather than showcasing itself. By the time the film ends, you don't remember specific sets as spectacle. You remember how they made you feel: transient, grounded, slightly hollow, like places passed through rather than lived in. That emotional aftertaste is the mark of thoughtful visual craftsmanship. The cinematography of the old guard understands a crucial truth. Immortality isn't glossy. It isn't operatic. It's repetitive. Cinematographer Barry Ackroyd, best known for his raw, kinetic work on The Hurt Locker, United 93, and the Bourne films, brings that sensibility here with deliberate control. His camera doesn't chase beauty. It chases immediacy. And that choice defines the film's visual identity. Ackroyd's style is rooted in realism, and Prince-Bythewood leans into that partnership. The camera often feels embedded rather than observational, as if it's standing in the room with the characters instead of composing them from a distance. Handheld movement dominates, but not in the jittery, chaotic way that defines some action cinema. This is purposeful instability. The frame breathes. It sways slightly. It reacts. That subtle motion creates intimacy even during combat, keeping the audience physically close to the action. Action sequences are shot with clarity rather than confusion, which is no small feat in a genre prone to visual excess. Ackroyd favors medium shots and grounded framing, allowing bodies to stay legible in motion. You see who's hitting whom. You understand spatial relationships. There's no visual dishonesty here. No cutting to hide choreography. No camera shake used as camouflage. The violence feels physical because the camera respects physicality. Lighting choices reinforce the film's emotional tone. Natural and practical light dominate interiors. Windows, lamps, streetlights, sources that exist within the world shape the image. Faces are often partially shadowed, never fully illuminated. That visual fragmentation mirrors the characters' internal states. These are people carrying histories they don't fully reveal. The lighting lets that ambiguity live on their faces. Color grading continues the film's commitment to restraint. The palette is cool and muted, drained of vibrancy. Blues, grays, and steel tones dominate the present-day sequences, giving the world a slightly desaturated, worn-down feel. This isn't aesthetic minimalism for its own sake, it's thematic. Immortality has leached color from the world. When warmth appears, it feels intentional, rare, earned. Flashbacks are handled with notable discipline. Ackroyd doesn't romanticize the past with golden hues or sweeping crane shots. Instead, historical sequences retain the same visual grit as the present, sometimes even harsher. Grain becomes more apparent. Contrast deepens. The past feels heavier, not prettier. That decision reinforces the film's core idea: history isn't a refuge, it's a burden. Camera movement during dialogue scenes is particularly telling. Ackroyd often allows the camera to drift slightly rather than lock into static compositions. It creates the sense that conversations are unsettled, never fully resolved. Even moments of connection carry an undercurrent of unease. The camera doesn't let us relax, because the characters can't either. One of the film's most effective visual strategies is its refusal to mythologize the immortals. There are no heroic low-angle shots announcing dominance. No slow-motion walks into battle framed as iconography. When characters fall in combat, the camera goes with them. Down to the ground. Into the dirt. Immortality doesn't elevate them above violence. It traps them inside it. That visual philosophy quietly subverts decades of genre convention. Editing and cinematography work in lockstep. Cuts are functional, not flashy. The rhythm favors momentum over spectacle. Even large-scale action beats feel contained, almost claustrophobic. That containment reinforces the idea that no matter how expansive the world is, these characters are confined by their condition. The camera never lets them feel truly free. There's also a noticeable absence of visual bravado for bravado's sake. No gratuitous drone shots. No indulgent visual flourishes designed to impress rather than serve. When the camera pulls back, it's to contextualize isolation. When it moves in, it's to capture fatigue. Every movement feels motivated by character rather than ego. What ultimately makes the cinematography resonate is its consistency with the film's emotional logic. The visuals don't argue with the story. They echo it. They reinforce exhaustion, intimacy, and consequence. They make immortality feel heavy rather than heroic. And that alignment between form and theme gives The Old Guard a visual coherence many action films lack. Sound N. The Old Guard doesn't try to dominate your attention. It settles under your skin. The film's audio landscape is built on restraint, much like its visuals, and that restraint becomes its defining strength. Composer Volker Bertelmann, also known as Hauschka, approaches the score less as musical accompaniment and more as emotional pressure. The music doesn't tell you what to feel. It creates space for feeling to happen. Bertelmann's background in minimalist, experimental composition shapes the score's identity. Instead of sweeping orchestral themes, he favors textures. Piano motifs that feel slightly off-kilter, electronic pulses that hum rather than swell, sustained tones that linger just long enough to become uncomfortable. The score breathes. It waits. And that patience aligns perfectly with a story about characters who have nothing but time. One of the most striking aspects of the music is its refusal to romanticize immortality. There's no heroic anthem announcing the group's presence, no triumphant leitmotif signaling victory. When music enters during action scenes, it often undercuts rather than amplifies. Rhythms are restrained. Melodies are fragmented. The score doesn't elevate violence, it frames it as routine. Another job, another fight, another wound that will heal but still hurt. Silence plays an equally important role. The film frequently allows scenes to unfold without musical guidance, trusting ambient sound to carry emotional weight. Footsteps echo. Weapons clatter. Breathing becomes audible. These moments ground the film in physical reality, reminding the audience that immortality doesn't cancel sensation. Pain still registers. Fear still spikes. Silence becomes a way of letting those sensations surface unfiltered. When the score does step forward emotionally, it's often tied to introspection rather than action. Andy's quieter moments. Those stretches of stillness where exhaustion creeps in are underscored with sparse, almost hesitant piano lines. Notes don't resolve cleanly, they hover. That lack of resolution mirrors her internal state. There's no musical catharsis because there is no emotional closure, just continuation. Nile's arc is supported by subtle shifts in the score's texture. Early cues around her feel dissonant and unstable, echoing her confusion and resistance. As she begins to understand her place within the group, the music doesn't become brighter, it becomes steadier, less fractured. That evolution is nearly subconscious, but it reinforces her journey from disruption to integration. Sound design complements the score with equal care. Gunfire is sharp and unembellished. Punches land with dull, heavy impact. There's no exaggerated crunch or stylized echo. Violence sounds unpleasant because it is. Healing, too, has a sound. Bones snapping back into place, breath rushing in, bodies reorienting. Those audio details make immortality feel invasive rather than miraculous. Healing isn't silent, it's visceral. The mix prioritizes clarity over bombast. Dialogue is never drowned out by score or effects, even during action-heavy sequences. That choice keeps character front and center. Conversations matter. Words matter. In a film where philosophy and fatigue drive the narrative, allowing dialogue to breathe is essential. The soundscape supports that by staying disciplined. One of the film's most effective audio moments comes not from music, but from its absence. In scenes dealing with loss or revelation, the soundtrack often drops away entirely. No cue to guide emotion. No swell to soften the impact. Just space. That emptiness forces the audience to sit with discomfort, mirroring the character's experience. Immortality doesn't come with emotional insulation. The sound design refuses to provide it. Licensed music is used sparingly and strategically. When contemporary tracks appear, they feel grounded in the character's lived reality rather than imposed for style. The selections never overpower the film's tone. They function as cultural texture, not commentary. This restraint prevents tonal whiplash and keeps the film cohesive. What ties the score and sound design together is intention. Nothing feels accidental. Every choice serves the same thematic purpose, stripping away glamour and leaving endurance. The audio landscape doesn't chase memorability in the traditional sense. You don't leave humming a theme. You leave remembering how the film felt: heavy, muted, persistent. Every film that feels effortless on screen is anything but behind the scenes, and The Old Guard is no exception. Its production journey is defined by logistical complexity, physical demand, and a deliberate attempt to reconcile intimate storytelling with global-scale action. This wasn't a shoot built around green screens and controlled environments. It was built around movement across countries, climates, and tightly scheduled days that left little room for error. Principal photography spanned multiple international locations, including the UK and Morocco, chosen not for visual spectacle, but for textural authenticity. These weren't postcard backdrops. They were working spaces, streets, interiors, training grounds, adapted to feel functional rather than cinematic. Shooting on location introduced unpredictability, shifting light, weather complications, ambient noise. Instead of fighting those variables, the production often incorporated them. That decision reinforces the film's lived-in aesthetic. Imperfection becomes part of the texture. Gina Prince-Bythewood's on-set approach emphasized preparation over improvisation. Action sequences were rehearsed extensively before cameras rolled, allowing actors to perform with confidence and minimizing reliance on coverage. Heavy shooting. This wasn't about capturing chaos and finding coherence in the edit. It was about clarity from the start. That discipline shows in the finished film's action grammar. You can track bodies, understand intent, and feel consequence. Charlize Theron's involvement extended beyond performance. As a producer, she was deeply embedded in shaping the film's tone and physical credibility. Her prior experience in physically demanding roles informed how action was staged and performed. Theron trained extensively with the stunt team, prioritizing safety without compromising intensity. That balance mattered. Injuries weren't treated as badges of honor, they were risks to be mitigated. Longevity fittingly was the goal. The ensemble trained together, not just for choreography, but for cohesion. Time spent rehearsing as a unit helped establish trust and rhythm, which translated directly to on-screen chemistry. These weren't isolated performers dropping into set pieces. They moved like a group that had learned how to fight, recover, and regroup together. That unity can't be faked in post-production. Scheduling was another challenge. Coordinating a multinational cast across locations required precision. Days were tight. Night shoots were common. Fatigue was real. Rather than push actors into exhaustion for the sake of authenticity, Prince-Bythewood adjusted pacing when necessary. That flexibility reflects her performance, first philosophy. The film values presence over punishment. Technical challenges also shaped the shoot. Balancing practical effects with digital enhancements required constant coordination between departments. Healing sequences, in particular, demanded careful planning. They had to feel visceral without becoming grotesque. Achieving that balance meant layering practical performance, sound design, and subtle visual effects rather than relying on overt CGI. The goal was believability, not spectacle. One of the most telling behind-the-scenes dynamics was the emphasis on communication. Prince-Bythewood fostered an environment where actors and crew could voice concerns, ask questions, and suggest adjustments. That openness matters on a production of this scale. It prevents small issues from becoming systemic problems. It also builds trust, which is essential when working with physically demanding material. The shoot wasn't without strain, but there's little evidence of chaos. No stories of volatile sets or creative breakdowns. Instead, the production narrative is one of steady execution. That stability reflects leadership, clear vision, consistent tone, and respect for collaboration. Films that try to do too much often fracture under pressure. The Old Guard avoids that by knowing exactly what it is and what it isn't. Post-production reinforced those choices rather than reinventing them. Editing favored continuity and character clarity. Visual effects were integrated quietly. Nothing was added simply because it could be. The film resisted the temptation to escalate artificially in the final stretch, trusting that emotional investment would carry the weight. That restraint is rare and risky in modern action filmmaking. By the time The Old Guard reached completion, it carried the fingerprints of a production that prioritized coherence over chaos. The film feels unified because it was made that way. Every department pulled in the same direction, guided by a vision that valued endurance over excess. Measuring the commercial performance of The Old Guard requires recalibrating what success even means. This wasn't a theatrical release chasing opening weekend headlines or box office milestones. It premiered on Netflix in July 2020, right in the middle of a global shutdown that had already rewritten distribution rules. Theaters were closed. Studios were scrambling. Audiences were home. In that environment, The Old Guard didn't just release. It arrived at exactly the right moment. Netflix doesn't operate on ticket sales, and it doesn't release traditional revenue figures. Instead, success is measured in viewership, retention, and cultural penetration. By those metrics, The Old Guard performed exceptionally well. Netflix publicly stated that the film was watched by tens of millions of households within its first month, placing it among the platform's most successful original films at the time. That number isn't just marketing fluff. It signals algorithmic confidence. Netflix promotes what performs, and The Old Guard was promoted aggressively long after its debut week. Context matters here. Mid-2020 was crowded with streaming releases, but few original action films felt genuinely cinematic. Many were rushed, compromised, or designed as content rather than events. The Old Guard stood out because it didn't feel disposable. It had scale. It had stars. It had a tone distinct from the glossy sameness that defined much of streaming action cinema. That distinction translated into sustained engagement rather than a brief spike. Budget estimates, while not officially confirmed, place the film in the mid-range for Netflix action features. Significant, but not exorbitant. What matters isn't the exact number. It's the return on investment logic. Netflix prioritizes subscriber retention and acquisition. A film that keeps viewers engaged, generates conversation, and signals brand ambition delivers value beyond a single viewing metric. The Old Guard did all three. The film also benefited from international appeal. Its diverse cast, global locations, and genre accessibility made it an easy export. Unlike dialogue-heavy dramas that struggle across language barriers, action translates. And The Old Guard's emphasis on physical storytelling, combined with its emotional clarity, made it legible to audiences worldwide. That global performance aligns perfectly with Netflix's business model, which prioritizes cross-market scalability. Longevity is another key factor. Many streaming films spike and vanish. The Old Guard lingered. It remained visible in Netflix's interface, resurfaced in recommendations, and continued to attract new viewers well after its release window. That staying power matters more than any opening week statistic. It suggests rewatchability, word-of-mouth traction, and algorithmic favor, all indicators of long-term value. Merchandising and ancillary revenue weren't primary drivers here, but the film's success did extend beyond the platform. Interest in the original graphic novel spiked following the release, introducing new readers to Greg Rucka's work. That cross-media boost reinforces the film's commercial footprint even outside traditional revenue streams. It also strengthened the property's viability as a franchise. Perhaps the clearest indicator of commercial success came not in numbers, but in decisions. Netflix greenlit a sequel. Streaming platforms don't commit to follow-ups lightly, especially for effects. Heavy action properties. A sequel represents confidence, not just in viewership, but in sustained audience interest. It signals that the old guard wasn't consumed as disposable content. It was retained as intellectual property with growth potential. It's also worth noting how the film reshaped expectations for Netflix originals. At the time, many viewers still associated streaming action with compromised production values or algorithm-driven sameness. The old guard challenged that perception. It felt intentional, directed, authored. That perception shift has commercial value, even if it doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It positions the platform as a home for filmmaker-driven genre work rather than just volume. Critically, the film's success didn't depend on universal acclaim or awards buzz. It depended on accessibility without dilution. The old guard trusted its audience to engage with heavier themes inside a familiar genre wrapper. That trust paid off commercially. People didn't just watch it, they finished it. They talked about it. They recommended it. In the streaming era, that combination is gold. Attention is the currency, and the old guard held it. Not by being loud, but by being distinct. Critical reception for The Old Guard landed in a space that's deceptively hard to occupy, broadly positive, thoughtfully divided, and deeply revealing about what audiences and critics expect from action cinema. The film wasn't hailed as a genre revolution, but it also wasn't dismissed as disposable streaming content. Instead, it sparked a conversation about tone, ambition, and what serious action films are allowed to be. Many critics responded immediately to Gina Prince-Bythewood's direction. Praise centered on the film's emotional intelligence, specifically, its refusal to glamorize violence or immortality. Reviewers highlighted how the film treats its premise as a philosophical burden rather than a power fantasy, calling attention to its melancholy undercurrent. That tonal seriousness set it apart from many contemporaries and earned respect even from critics lukewarm on the genre itself. Charlize Theron's performance became a focal point of acclaim. Critics consistently noted how she subverted the typical action hero mold, playing Andy as worn down rather than pumped up. Her physicality was praised, but what resonated more was her restraint. Reviewers pointed to her ability to convey centuries of exhaustion with minimal dialogue, framing the performance as the film's emotional backbone rather than its spectacle engine. The ensemble also drew positive notice, particularly the portrayal of Joe and Nikki. Critics and audiences alike responded strongly to the film's matter-of-fact treatment of their relationship. It wasn't framed as novelty or subtext, it simply existed. That normalcy was widely appreciated, with many reviewers calling it one of the film's most quietly progressive elements. Representation here wasn't loud, but it was confident, and that confidence earned goodwill. That said, the film didn't escape criticism. The most common point of contention was pacing. Some critics felt the midsection sagged under the weight of introspection, arguing that the film occasionally struggled to balance action momentum with thematic exploration. For viewers expecting a relentless action ride, the quieter stretches felt indulgent. Others countered that those same moments were the film's greatest strength. The divide wasn't about quality. It was about expectation. The antagonist also became a lightning rod for critique. Several reviews described the villain as underdeveloped or too conventional, especially when contrasted with the film's otherwise thoughtful approach. For some, that simplicity undermined the stakes. For others, it felt intentional, a reflection of the banality of exploitation rather than a failure of imagination. This disagreement speaks to the film's larger tension between genre convention and thematic ambition. Audience reception mirrored this split, though skewed slightly more favorable. Viewers who connected with the film's emotional core tended to champion it passionately, framing it as a refreshing alternative to hollow blockbuster formulas. Those less engaged with its introspective tone often labeled it slow or uneven. What's notable is how rarely the film was described as forgettable. Whether praised or critiqued, it made an impression. On social media, the conversation extended beyond traditional film criticism. Discussions around representation, female-led action films, and the legitimacy of streaming originals all intersected around The Old Guard. Many viewers framed it as proof that action cinema doesn't need theatrical release to feel substantial. Others pointed to it as evidence that genre films can carry emotional and philosophical weight without alienating mainstream audiences. Awards attention was modest but meaningful. While the film didn't dominate major ceremonies, it appeared in year-end conversations about action performances and genre direction. Its relative absence from awards races had less to do with quality and more to do with timing and platform bias. Streaming action films still face an uphill battle in prestige spaces, regardless of craft. Over time, the film's reputation has aged well. Initial critiques about pacing have softened as viewers revisit the film with adjusted expectations. What once felt slow now reads as deliberate. What felt restrained now feels confident. Reassessment has been kind, especially among audiences fatigued by louder, emptier genre offerings. Ultimately, The Old Guard's critical reception reflects its identity. It isn't universally adored, but it is widely respected. It didn't chase consensus, and it didn't beg approval. It made specific choices, stood by them, and accepted division as the cost of ambition. In an industry increasingly shaped by algorithms optimized for lowest common denominator appeal, that willingness to polarize feels almost radical. At its core, The Old Guard is a film about endurance, not the cinematic kind that celebrates invincibility, but the human kind that asks what survives after belief erodes. Immortality here isn't a superpower, it's a condition. One that strips life of urgency while amplifying loss. Gina Prince-Bythewood's film keeps returning to that paradox, circling it from different emotional angles until a quiet truth settles in. Living forever doesn't give life meaning. Choosing to care does. The film's central theme is purpose under erosion. Andy and her team have watched institutions fail, ideals rot, and victories undo themselves. Time hasn't clarified morality, it has complicated it. The question the film keeps asking, sometimes aloud, often silently, is why continue? Why protect a world that doesn't learn? The answer isn't heroism, it's responsibility. Not because the world deserves saving, but because abandoning it would mean surrendering the last thread of selfhood these characters have left. That idea runs directly through Andy's arc. Her exhaustion isn't physical, it's philosophical. She's tired of believing that actions matter, tired of hope as an obligation. What shifts her isn't a revelation about the world improving, but a reminder that impact doesn't always announce itself. The film argues that meaning is often deferred, invisible until decades or centuries later. That belief is fragile, almost irrational. The film embraces that fragility rather than resolving it. Nile's presence reframes the narrative around renewal. She represents interruption. New blood, new questions, new refusal to accept despair as wisdom. Importantly, the film doesn't present her optimism as superior. It presents it as necessary. Without her, the group calcifies. With her, they're forced to articulate why they keep going. Nile doesn't fix immortality's curse. She challenges its resignation. Another theme that quietly underpins the film is legacy. Not legacy as reputation, but as consequence. The immortals don't get statues or history books. Their influence is indirect medical advances inspired, wars subtly shifted, lives saved anonymously. The film suggests that real legacy often goes uncredited, and that impact doesn't require recognition to be real. That's a deeply unglamorous idea, and the film leans into it fully. Love, too, is framed as resistance. Joe and Nikki's relationship isn't just representation, it's thematic reinforcement. Their love persists not because time allows it, but because time tests it. In a film obsessed with what endures, their bond becomes proof that connection can outlast violence. Not untouched by it, but undefeated. Love here isn't salvation, it's shelter. The film also carries a subtle critique of modern exploitation. The desire to monetize immortality is framed as inevitable, almost dull in its predictability. Capitalism doesn't marvel at miracles, it itemizes them. By making the antagonist's motivation so ordinary, the film shifts attention back to the protagonist's choice to remain human rather than profitable. That choice, refusing ownership, becomes an act of defiance. As a genre piece, The Old Guard doesn't reinvent action cinema, and it doesn't try to. Its ambition lies elsewhere. It proves that action films can be contemplative without collapsing under their own seriousness. That restraint may frustrate viewers craving constant escalation, but it's precisely what gives the film its identity. It trusts atmosphere over adrenaline, character over chaos. Its weaknesses are real. The narrative occasionally leans too heavily on familiar genre scaffolding. Certain antagonistic elements feel undercooked, and the film's commitment to restraint sometimes edges into flatness where sharper tension could have elevated stakes. These aren't fatal flaws, but they are limitations. Yet, when weighed against its strengths, cohesive vision, grounded performances, thematic clarity, those limitations feel like the cost of intentionality rather than oversight. The Old Guard knows what it wants to be, and it doesn't chase approval from audiences expecting something else. In the context of Gina Prince-Bythewood's career, the film represents an expansion rather than a departure. It carries the same emotional intelligence as her earlier work, scaled up without dilution. For Charlize Theron, it stands as one of her most quietly complex action performances. Less about dominance, more about durability. The film's legacy will likely grow rather than fade. In an era saturated with loud, interchangeable content, The Old Guard remains distinct because it refuses to shout. It lingers. It asks uncomfortable questions. It respects its audience enough not to answer all of them. So, who is this film for? For viewers willing to sit with ambiguity. For those who believe action cinema can carry thought without apology. For anyone who's ever felt tired of the world but kept going anyway. Because, in the end, The Old Guard isn't about living forever. It's about finding reasons, however small, however delayed, to live at all.